did. Do you remember being asked questions about whether or not you believed Miss Arias?
Yes.
And do you remember talking about going into a case with a certain amount of skepticism?
Yes, I do.
Can you tell us what you meant?
Whenever I take...
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the objection.
Relevance.
Overlook.
When I take or when I investigate a case, I don't presume that what I'm being told is the truth. I need to figure that out for myself. I need to have enough to go on. And there are cases I don't take because there either is not enough evidence from my perspective, or I don't believe the person I'm talking to, or I don't have enough time to do a good job. But I have gone into cases and been halfway through cases where I decided that I couldn't testify in those cases. I have testified for a police officer who...
So when you first are on a case and you say you enter the case with some skepticism until you have some more information, right?
Yes.
Did you do that in this case?
Yes.
And did you have skepticism when you first met with Miss Arias? Before you first met with Miss Arias?
Yes, I didn't want to, I wasn't sure I wanted to take this case at all.
Okay. And after speaking with Miss Arias, was she able to answer some of your questions that you had?
Yes.
And working throughout this case, was there ever a time that you felt you needed to withdraw from it?
Objection relevance.
May I approach, Judge? Ms. Violet, during your time on this case, when you are investigating it and looking through all of the evidence, as you said you've done in the past withdrawn from a case, did you ever feel the need to withdraw from this case?
No.
All right. So let's... When you first met with Miss Arias, do you remember the questions about apologizing to her?
Yes, I do.
The fact that, why did you apologize to her?
Because I was genuinely sorry that I invaded private space, that people, things that people write and things that people pour out on a page that they believe is private, that's not something that I usually do. And I wanted her to know that I understood what I was doing. And I thought that in her understanding that maybe we'd have a little trust and she would be able to talk to me more easily.
And is her situation different from when you're counseling or when you have battered women come and speaking to you? Are those women coming to you with their problems?
They are, but they generally don't tell me lots of things when they first meet me. It's usually over a period of time when they begin to trust you, and the same with the other folks that I work with. As one of my clients just said, you know, Alice,
So is it different than with Miss Arias? Because at the point that you met her, did you already know a lot of very personal information about her?
yes, I did.
And information that most of us would consider, well, in a sexual nature. Did you know a lot of information about sex contact between her and Mr. Alexander?
Yes,
And is that something that is normally kept in private?
yes, it is.
And so is that what your apology had to do with?
Objection has been answered.
Sustained.
So when you went in there and apologized to her, is there anything about that that makes you feel like you were biased already for her?
Not at all, no.
Were you ever concerned about liking her too much that you can't give an honest opinion about whether or not she's a battered woman?
No, I just haven't had that come up in a situation where I've liked somebody so much that I can't remove myself. I mean, testimony to me is very significant and very important, and it doesn't matter what kind of case it is, and this case is very serious. But I think when people are talking about losing their children or not having access to their children or losing an inheritance, whatever that would be.
Sustained.
Judge, she's explaining why it's important.
Ask another question.
In your counseling, when you have clients come in your door and you're having your your men's group,
Yes,
and some of those men, I imagine, in the past have done some pretty awful things to people, right?
correct.
The fact that some of those men may have done pretty awful things and you don't like what they've done, does that make it so that you're not able to work with them?
No, it doesn't.
And when you have battered women come and see you, and you might feel badly for their situation or what they've been through, do you ever feel that way for them?
Yes,
Does it mean that you can't work with them and give them an honest assessment of what they might need to do for their own life?
no, it doesn't.
And did you have any problems like that when you were talking with Miss Arias and forming your opinion with regard to this case, being a domestically violent relationship?
No, I did not.
All right, let's talk for a second about a couple of small details from Miss Arias' past, okay?
Sure.
Do you remember being asked questions about a childhood friend of hers who knew her when she was in grade school?
Yes,
And did you review a interview of this childhood friend from Miss Arias that she knew her in grade school?
yes,
And this interview would have been, because we're talking about a friend of hers from grade school, this interview would have been conducted about 20 years after this woman knew Miss Arias, right?
correct.
Do you remember being asked questions about what some of the things that this woman said
Yes,
about Miss Arias?
yes,
And were you asked questions about whether or not Miss Arias would play a victim when she was in grade school?
yes,
And then later on, the prosecutor talked, well, immediately after that, the prosecutor talked to you about something that occurs much later in Miss Arias's life, when she is actually after June 4th working at the Purple Plum. Do you remember that?
Yes,
And how did the prosecutor ask you questions about how she acted with men in working at the Purple Plum?
correct.
Those two incidents from grade school and then after June 4th of 2008, 20-some years later, does that in any way form a pattern for you?
No, it doesn't.
Is there any possible way that two incidents, 20-some years apart, is going to make a pattern in your line of work?
Not that I can see, and not regarding domestic violence.
Okay. And the prosecutor was talking to you about also some of the things that Mr. Arias talked about, his own daughter, right?
Yes,
And you said you were trying to tell the prosecutor some of the things that you would want to consider with whatever Mr. Arias said about her, right?
correct.
What are some of the things that you would want to consider about Mr. Arias?
Well, for one thing, it's pretty tough when a parent has to look at their own behavior in relationship to their children.
What do you mean?
So, according to reports, Mr. Arias has been abusive with Jodi and controlling and manipulative with his wife, and there are patterns of that. So it would be difficult to have to tell somebody that. So that would be one thing.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd consider?
Well, I consider that Mr. Arias and his daughter had an estranged relationship. So communication between the two of them hadn't been good for years, and that they didn't have regular communication. So what he said would come out of a sort of a limited framework. And after she moved back to Wairika, which was some, I think, 10 years or so after she had left, and they hadn't had a lot of contact.
Well, you asked questions about a comment from him about Miss Arias' truthfulness when she was a teenager.
Yes,
And so Mr. Arias is talking about a time when Jodi was around 14, right?
correct.
Does it mean anything to you that a parent has an issue with a teenager's truthfulness? Is that unusual?
It's not unusual. People with teenagers know it's not unusual.
So would you take that into consideration in whether or not Miss Arias was truthful during her lifetime prior to June 4th?
No, I mean, my understanding is that it was more sins of omission than commission, that she didn't directly lie as much as she didn't tell them what was going on.
All right. And this was, again, back when she was 14.
Right.
And you remember the prosecutor talking to you about these incidents then? Something from grade school, something from 14, and then something after June 4th, right?
Correct.
And that was in response to your comments about no indication of Miss Arias being untruthful prior to June 4th, right?
Correct.
Anything that the prosecutor said to you change your mind about her truthfulness?
No. He was talking about isolated instances. He was not talking about patterns that you could trace. And I didn't take isolated instances from Mr. Alexander's background and hold that up and say,
Sustained.
So something that would be considered an isolated incident for Mr. Alexander, would that carry much weight with you?
no, it wouldn't.
And when you're talking about patterns with regard to Mr. Alexander or incidents with regard to Mr. Alexander, are you speaking in a global sense of patterns that you see with him?
Currently, or as
Yes, I'm sorry, currently.
Okay, yes, I'm talking about patterns that I see over the time that he was in relationship with Miss Arias that appeared to have been present before.
One of the things the prosecutor talked to you about is your continuum, right? We've been over this.
Yes.
And how do you use this continuum?
I actually have used it a lot in doing training. I use it in conjunction with Michael Johnson's work and Amy Holdsworth Monroe and Gregory Stewart's work. And what I do is explain to people about sort of a context of abusive behavior, a range of abusive behavior. And if I have enough time, I show them a video clip and then ask them to break up into groups and assess and create interventions for people so that they begin to look at this range of behaviors and what might be effective ways of intervening with folks to help them out. And then we come together and we do a case conference together. So I use this more in training. I used it in one child custody case where there was a situation of flight risk and dual passports because the judge really thought about domestic...
Objection, relevance, speculation.
Sustained.
Did you use this in another case before?
Yes, I used it in a child custody case.
All right, so it was not a criminal case?
No, it wasn't.
And was it to help explain to the judge your opinion?
Objection made.
It was to help explain that terrorism wasn't the only kind of domestic violence.
Okay, so is that something that can be helpful with this continuum for people to understand that you don't have to have the most severe type of domestic violence in order for it to be domestic violence?
Yes, and that's one of the most difficult areas, I think, for people to look at, is that you don't have to be a terrorist to create fear and apprehension in someone.
Okay. One of the things that the prosecutor talked to you about is sexual humiliation and degradation. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And he was asking you questions about whether or not Mr. Alexander would fit into that category that he was sexually humiliated and degraded, right?
Correct.
You remember being asked questions about something that Mr. Alexander said during one of his tirades with Miss Arias about feeling like a dildo with a heartbeat.
Yes.
And you talked about that there was much more in that tirade versus just that statement, right?
Correct.
And so, having just that statement alone, can you place him and say that he is sexually humiliated and degraded from that single statement?
No, I can't.
Why not?
Because it's one statement, and because I've seen a history of their sexual relationship, and it doesn't appear that he has felt sexually humiliated or degraded by Miss Arias's behavior.
All right. Did you review an email from Lisa Andrews to Mr. Alexander?
Yes.
And in that email, was she talking about their sexual contact between the two of them?
Yes, she was.
And was she talking about being uncomfortable?
She was talking about feeling like maybe she was used and maybe he cared more about her body than her. Yes.
Okay. And do you remember the prosecutor asking you questions that somehow in this email, Mr. Alexander was the one who was sexually humiliated because Miss Andrews somehow went too far with him?
Yes.
Objection was characterized as a question.
Approach. May continue.
And you're aware that Miss Andrews, at the time that Mr. Alexander was dating her, was about 10 or 11 years younger than he was?
Yes,
And when she had this discussion with him about going too far, did she take some of the blame for him kissing her and him having contact with her?
Objection, lack of foundation. Source.
Sustained.
Did you review an email from Miss Andrews?
yes, I did.
Okay. May I approach? Showing you Exhibit 385. Second paragraph. All right, so is she talking to him about actually blaming herself for him kissing her?
Yes,
And throughout the conversation that you've reviewed between Miss Andrews and Mr. Alexander, is she talking about, as you said before, feeling used and that he thinks of sex too much?
yes,
Is that somebody who you would consider to be sexually humiliated or degraded?
that
That Mr.
Miss Andrews-
Alexander is sexually humiliated?
Oh, no, I would not.
Okay. And you've reviewed or listened to an audio tape that is a phone sex tape between Mr. Alexander and Miss Arias, right?
Correct.
And this was May 10th of 2008?
Yes, it was.
And in listening to the words on that particular tape, does Mr. Alexander in any way sound uncomfortable?
No, he doesn't.
Does he sound humiliated?
No, he doesn't.
Does Miss Arias say anything to him that degrades him?
Not that I can remember.
Okay. On the other hand, did you speak with Miss Arias about some of the sexual contact that she had with Mr. Alexander?
Yes,
And do you remember being asked questions about some of their first sexual contact between the two of them?
yes,
And was Miss Arias uncomfortable with it?
yes, she was.
Because why?
She thought it was too much too soon.
Okay. So, but she went along with it anyway, right?
Yes, she did.
And is that something she talked to you about that she did several times throughout the relationship?
Yes,
And did she feel that she got more attention from Mr. Alexander when she gave him the sexual things that he wanted?
Objection,
yes, in fact, she said that
objection beyond scope.
Sustained.
No, Judge. May we approach?
Well, you can ask a follow-up question. She answered yes. So you can ask a follow-up question.
All right. Then following up on that, what did she say to you?
she said this in an email or one of those written
Objection,
forms.
lack of foundation. Source. Email or.
Sustained.
Whether it's an email or an instant message, does it matter to you?
No,
Was it written communication?
it was written communication.
Okay, and what is it that you learned?
Objection, lack of foundation. Source.
Approach, please. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to take the evening recess. Please be back tomorrow morning tomorrow is 10:30. 10:30 a.m. Have a nice evening. Remember the admonition. The jury has left the courtroom. We are at recess.